At this particular focus, at this juncture where our material and our experience and our ideas come together, we need to have two different movements at the same time in order for stability. At this stage of history, two distinct movements occur. One of them is to get very personal, and the other is to get very contextual. I might make it a little easier to remember by saying one of them becomes person, the other becomes cosmos. Person and cosmos. So that those two movements now engender together. The personal is the need to found something, anchor something in an individual way. And the context is to be able to format a positioning of the individual in such a way that the anchor proves to hold vis-a-vis this larger context. You can think of a ship on an ocean, and the only way that a ship on an ocean finds its true harbor is that the anchor is able to touch bottom. And don't be misled that you have to have sight of land. There are many parts of seas that have sandbars, and you can get safe anchorage even hundreds of miles out from any shoreline as long as your anchor touches bottom. And so the mariner's phrase is safe anchorage and not any port in the storm. Any port in a storm is a landlubber's idea of safety, but safe anchorage is a mariner's idea. So the two different movements here are for the individual, for the distinctive existential me, I, and that vis-a-vis a context which is large enough and referential enough to be able to take care of all of the exigencies of a situation. And generally that context needs to be layered because it's a very rare person that can get the whole picture at once. Usually it's layered. And so larger pictures have specific numerical layers. The traditional numerical layer was 7 layers, 7 heavens, 7 planets, 7 levels. And on a more sophisticated standpoint, the 7 are seen to be 9. So the traditional wisdom was that a terrestrial universe has 7 levels, but a celestial universe has 9 levels. From God's viewpoint, there is a 9-fold quality, an Aeneid, but from man's perspective, there's a 7-fold, and that was called a hymarmene in Greek, septem in Latin. So there are a lot of words that begin with septem that refer to this kind of a situation. So two different movements are required. One to get very personal, the other to get the larger picture. And both of them have to occur at the same time. So we're going to use Teresa and Tacitus today to try and focus on why it is that the problems of getting very individual are at the same time the very problems of trying to get a larger context. The fact that the common denominator between these two movements is the same set of problems is an indication of their final ability to form a whole. The reconciliation of opposites is not in terms of common elements pro, but in terms of common elements con. We unite opposites by their similar problems rather than uniting opposites by their similar advantages. The ego always makes the mistake of looking for the advantages that are shared, and thus creates a dualistic, polarized world. Always does this. In fact, one of the distinguishing, one might even say medicinally distinguishing aspects of an egotistic personality versus a spiritual personality is a spiritual personality always faces the problems, whereas an egotistical personality always faces the possibilities with a clever angle to get them affected, to get through. What I'm going to say has peculiarities in it. So I'll start off with St. Teresa and then move over to Tacitus. Teresa as the individual, Tacitus making the larger context. In Teresa's life, the middle section of her life, in this Penguin Classics edition, pages 76 to 152, cover 4 stages of prayer, a quaternary. 4 stages of prayer which lead to a culmination, and the culmination in Teresa, because she's a world classic writer, also one of the world's great contemplatives, the conclusion that the 4 stages of prayer lead to is a life of continuous growth. So in the Penguin Classic, if you would turn to the end of chapter 21, you would find the section on a life of continuous growth. After return to the world, a life of continuous growth. And this continuous growth, you can substitute here a word everlasting, everlasting life. So that life everlasting is what occurs. Now the archetype for this, as a matter of fact, goes back to Egypt, back to archaic Egypt. And the basic notion there was that each day that is made is a form, is a time form. It's like a molecule of time. Each day is a molecule of time, and it joins the previous molecules of time, so that each day that God makes joins to the existing time of reality. And this means it can be extended indefinitely, open-endedly, everlastingly. So everlasting life was termed, I think the English phrase translating the ancient Egyptian would be living time. Someone who is saved enjoys living time in the everlastingness of life. And as long as God continues to make a new day, our life is extended by that day into the ocean of eternity. And so everlastingness has this quality. Distinctly different from the Egyptian archetype, and we might call the Egyptian archetype masculine, because it has a masculine character and tone to its structure. The tone is penetration to further life. Quite distinct from the Egyptian masculine tone is a feminine tone, a maternal archetype of life. And that maternal archetype of life developed not in Egypt, but in the archaic ancient Mideast, like in Sumeria and Elam, ancient Iran, ancient Persia. ancient Mesopotamia. And for handy reference, we could say that it's Mesopotamian, and that the Mesopotamian feminine archetype of life is distinctly different from the Egyptian masculine. The Egyptian masculine archetype of life is penetration through to a new day, adding that to everlastingness, whereas the Mesopotamian feminine is that these cycles always form some completeness, and that what is important is for the completeness to continue, for the circles to continue, for the circularity to reoccur. And so there is a distinct difference. The Egyptian focuses upon the center, whereas the Mesopotamian focuses upon the rim. The Egyptian archetype of God is always to find where the axle of time meets the center of the wheel of space, and it's there in that motionless center that one can penetrate through to the mystery. Whereas in the Mesopotamian, it's to be able to go on the complete revolution of the wheel and come back to a new revolution. So there are two distinct qualities. The Egyptian archetype leads to poignancy of individuality, the mystery of the oneness that I am, whereas the Mesopotamian leads to the all, to the many that finally become all, that all life is a single unified circle, the circle of life, that the cosmos then becomes indeed understandable from the matriarchal, ancient Mesopotamian, circular, cyclic way. To put it briefly, the ancient Mesopotamian was always symbolized by the Queen of Heaven, the Great Mother, risen off the earth to cosmic levels. She was the Queen of Heaven. Her original name was Anahita, and her name changed many times, vicissitudes. It became Ishtar, it became Isis, many different names. In our time, it, as you will see, became the Virgin Mary. Not when you thought, but not until 1950. Now this difference, these two movements, the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian, rarely came into contact. In historical circumstances, the only contact that they had at all was with the Jews. The only practical bridge between the two were the Jews. And the reason for this is that when the Mesopotamian civilization spread out about 2350 BC under Sargon of Akkad and became the Fertile Crescent for the first time in history, joining not only the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, Sargon's conquests in terms of trade routes went all the way from Crete to India. And it was the first time that all of that was knit together into one whole. And towards the end of that great international era, about 1900 BC, about 400 years later, the family that ran the last international caravans was the family of Abraham. Abraham's father was from Terah, which was right in the center of the Fertile Crescent caravan route. So Abraham and the origin of the Jews came into being as a remnant left over of a great single family world, knit together by the great goddess, the Queen of Heaven, who was always a comfort to man. The Egyptian patriarchal individuality is always a harrowing experience, a dangerous, suffering way that requires a masculine courage to get through, whereas the Mesopotamian, the Anahita's way, is all-embracing, all-loving, a completeness, a protection by inclusiveness. These two, as I say, these two movements developing in different ways, in different settings, had for about 400 years a kind of a meeting place. And towards the end of that 400-year period, when their contacts were dissolving so that only one strand linked them together, that one strand was the caravan route that Abraham ran his animals on. And his pack animals, incidentally, were not camels. Camels were not used in those days. Camels are much later. They used donkeys, a breed of wild ass that had black hair, not the gray donkey that you think of, but the short, wiry, black-haired wild ass tamed for a pack animal. They were able to cross the deserts and carry tremendous loads. And so the symbol, the first symbol of the Jews was the wild ass. The hieroglyph in the New Kingdom in Egypt for Jews was this wild ass. Not at all a derisive term like an ass, but an identification that this was the mark of their basis of wealth. They ran these caravans. So that 2,000 years later, when Jesus wanted to make a point about the true origins of things, when he rode into Jerusalem for the last time, he had set aside a wild ass. And when he rode into Jerusalem the last time to meet his death, he rode in on a wild ass to disclose to anybody who understood the larger context of things that he was a direct diagonal line all the way down through 2,000 years. And it was just it was a gauge of his comprehensiveness. Now, none of the disciples understood that. The only one who understood it was Mary Magdalene. But that's another story. Peter never got it. Paul wasn't even around. Mark wasn't born. Luke wasn't born. Matthew was really puzzled by it and noted it specifically. John was only 14 years old, and he didn't have much to do except to just try and keep up with his godfather. Jesus was about 30 years older than St. John. And he was just like a boy. That's why at the Last Supper he laid his head on Jesus' shoulder, because he's just a 14-year-old boy. And he wanted to know what's going to happen. And the man said, it's in good hands. So these archetypal symbols and images have a tremendous push in terms of meaning once somebody understands the context, but the context only comes into play if there's a trigger that activates it, and the trigger is always the person. Without the individual, the context is not anchored and doesn't work. Without the individual, the context simply repeats itself mechanically and only changes from a never-ending circle by the trigger of the individual. And when there's an individual, the circle is modified by the space of one person. And instead of being a circle, it becomes a spiral, quite infinitesimally small at first. But as the aeon rolls out, the space of that one person grows and grows, and instead of a circle, it becomes a spiral. And so you have evolution, you have development, you have progress. And at first, it's only noticeable by the difference of one person. Now this is very difficult to comprehend. Mystics of all ages have participated in the understanding of it, but rarely have had the ability to talk about it, and certainly haven't had the intellectual background to be able to knit it together and decorate it with all the um, canopy of symbolic ideas. Somebody like St. Teresa notices this, but notices it in such a way that her expression is colored by a massive tidal wave of conditioning that has gone on for 1,500 years. And so while St. Teresa is very accurate, she's very accurate through certain mauve-colored glasses. She sees exactly what's there, but she sees it through mauve-colored glasses. The glasses, the mauve-coloring glasses, are Roman Empire glasses. Now you can read for yourself the 4 stages. Just read chapters 11 through 21 of Teresa, and you can get the 4 stages. She's one of the best people in the world to outline this. She knew how to do this. She could get people through this. She has gotten millions of people through the 4 stages of contemplation. She's one of the great world figures. In a way, she's like a Henry Ford. She made a production line that was workable for hundreds of millions of people. Otherwise, they would never have gotten it. But there's a slight defect, and the defect was the defect that Henry Ford himself declared. You can have any color car you want as long as it's black. So while hundreds of millions of people have come through, they have all come through the same way. Why? Because Teresa is circular. She is ultimately not individual. She is ultimately Mesopotamian and not Egyptian. And incidentally, if you favor one or the other, you're never going to have a reconciliation of opposites. You have to know both, and you have to know how to bring them together. It takes 2 hands to make an effective prayer. You can't do it one-handed. You can caution, or you can threaten, but you can't resonate grace with just one hand. That's why the handshake is that meeting, that resonance. Now on page 76 of the Penguin Classics version of St. Teresa, just that one page, we're talking about one page and one page only, page 76. Everything that you need to know is on page 76, except that it's packed in so tight and tied with all kinds of mysteries that it's very difficult to read it. So we'll unpack it and untie it. She says that the 4 stages of prayer are our following the way of love. That God loves us greatly. And she will say God, and sometimes she will say the Lord. Occasionally she will say Him with a capital H. I think once or twice she says Christ. She never says Jesus. She never talks about the man, about Him with a capital, without the capital H. Because this is not about Jesus. This is about Christ. This is about God. This is about the Lord. This is about the Him who is within the great her. That's what this is about. She says, God loves us greatly, and the only way to Him is to come along that path of His love. That's the only access we have to Him. All that God gives out is love, so the only access to him is to follow that love back to him. And in order to follow that, we need to have a special quality, and she calls that the quality of being a servant of love. And this is the way the devotees of the great goddess have always taught. One has to become a servant of love. God's exuding of energy is love, and the only way to get to him is to follow that love back to him. And in order to do so, we have to become a servant of love. And so St. Teresa says, when we become a servant to love, we lose the servile fear that the world has bred into us. We have been taken by the world and crumpled into a shape the world wants. And what holds this crumpled shape together is the servile fear of the world. But as we become a servant of love, our fear of the world dissolves, and as our fear of the world dissolves into our service of love, we become more and more natural, and by the time we are received by God, having followed his way as a good servant, we are completely restored again. This is what she's talking about. Page 76, Life of St. Teresa. She says that it takes time to follow this way of love. It takes stages. It takes, in fact, 4 stages. And she says, preempting this whole question, well, why does it take 4 stages? Why can't we do it all at once? She says, quote, "We are so niggardly," and this is in the age before black consciousness made the word niggardly something that you can't use. It doesn't mean black-like. It means that we are so tight with our over-definitions that we do not have the largesse of spirit to allow something to happen. We are so niggardly and so slow to give ourselves entirely, to abandon everything. We do not prepare ourselves to secure that precious thing. So that part of the reason why it takes 4 stages and takes so long is that we were not prepared to do this. We were not prepared to follow love. And in the following love, we have to abandon things. In fact, we have to eventually abandon everything. And we're not predisposed to do that. We're not set up to do that. And so we have to take time to learn how to let go. And as we do so, we follow the way of love back to God. Yet, and a little later in the paragraphs, St. Teresa says something else. And so I put in here yet, not her yet, my yet. She's saying 2 different things. Why is she saying 2 different things? Because she understands the way of the Great Mother, the way of Anahita, the way of the Queen of Heaven, the all-inclusive circle. She understands that. But something has interposed itself, a veil, a mauve-colored veil has interposed itself 1,500 years before Teresa was ever born, and passed on like an infection. She says also, which His Majesty does not wish us to enjoy if we have not paid a high price first. Meaning that God is like a king. A king who requires of us a price. And when you pay the price of something, you're buying it. And that brings in money. But before there's money, before the money issue comes in, I'm going to show you just exactly how poignant it is. Before the money issue comes in, on a primordial level, on ritual level, paying the price for a thing is the exchange of the price for the thing, and this is reciprocity. So the anthropological bedrock of the ritual comportment is reciprocity. So Teresa brings up an issue of reciprocity, which is a ritual comportment. It means that thingness equals existence. And reciprocity always means a tribal context. It always means a tribal context that has a hierarchy, and that the head of the hierarchy is the king. Okay? This is in distinction to what she previously said about abandoning everything on the way of love. And abandoning is a symbol integration. It's the final stage of integration, as a matter of fact, in the symbolic level. So reciprocity is a ritual comportment, but abandoning is a symbol comportment, symbol integration. In fact, in abandoning, the emphasis is on no thing. And no thingness means its essence. So the reciprocity deals with existence, which is the body, and abandoning deals with no thingness, essences, which is the mind. So that Teresa has a dualism operative right here in the training manual. It's a dualism that God is, one, a savior that requires abandoning this world, but two, a king that requires the price to be paid in reciprocity. On the one, you have the soul as the mind's center. And that's a symbol level. On the other, you have sacrificial worthiness, which is a ritual body quality, and also a circle, the mythology of the circle. So that the body is absorbed in this Mesopotamian mother, queen of heaven, circularity, and the soul as this masculine individuality at the center of the mind, reached by abandoning, whereas the circle is completed by reciprocity, by ritual comportment. So right away you have the center versus the circle in a duality. You have the mind versus the body in a duality. You have cultural vanishing versus tribal expiation through a ritual justification, a reciprocal justification. On the one hand, you have integral perfection. On the other, you have reciprocal justification. Reciprocal justification always implies a judgment. And because it's a circular time form, there comes a time when the judgment will be the last judgment. And so the whole introduction of an apocalyptic era, where the good and bad, the sheep and the goats, are going to be separated, and the bad burnt like chaff, and the elect saved, is a concomitant of the Queen of Heaven archetype from the matriarchal Mesopotamian civilization. And quite distinct to this is that penetrating masculine soul center, salvation through abandoning all things. Not only no reciprocity, but no judging. What are you going to judge? There's nothing whatsoever. So that Teresa's 4 ways of prayer, 4 stages of the way of love, has within it a symbolic way leading to freedom, but also a ritual circle which leads to an annual return. An everlastingness in 2 distinct, separate ways, which are unresolvable in the form that they occur. They are not resolvable in this form. In fact, if you follow stages of circularity as a way of freedom, the only way to affect that is through a very, very peculiar quality of application, and the only mystic who ever successfully did this was Patanjali, the Yoga Sutras. It's almost impossible to do. Yeah, it can be done. It's very exotic. It's like working completely with trans-uranium elements in very odd soliton ways, and I suppose if you're a yogi sitting in the center of a black hole, well, you can do this sort of thing. But hanging around here on this planet, it's not recommended. The wisest thing about this is to open one's eyes and recognize that there are 2 irreconcilable qualities nestled in together here that don't get along, and because they don't get along and are not seeable as not getting along, their projections tend to find some object where they do express the not getting along, and it's usually the one goes to men and the other goes to women, so that men and women don't get along. And they don't get along on very deep submolecular level. Because sexuality begins before molecules are made. With some interesting research from the 1990s on sexual differentiation in molecules, incidentally. I have one of the volumes here. I'll show it to you. The problem is on such a deep, profound level that it's not reachable by ordinary analysis at all. Because one has to be able to go deeper than the analyzer to find it. And most people are severely limited in their analytical capacities. They can't even get to themselves, much less go deeper than themselves. So that Teresa then says, and now we'll read it with a little bit of comprehension, I see clearly that there is nothing in the world with which we could buy so great a blessing. This is her way, and it's a feminine way, of dealing with the duality. It doesn't resolve the duality, but it paradoxically takes care of the duality in favor of an ever larger all-inclusiveness of the circle. And as long as you don't question it too much, that way works. But what is left out, the fly in the ointment, the flaw, is that if you ever want to have exact, poignant individuality, remarkably unique personality, you'll run up against the flaw in the circle, because the circle, although it can be ever larger to include ever more refinement, it cannot include the exact perfection of the individual. That forever remains polarized vis-a-vis the circle. The center is never a part of the rim of a circle, is what we're saying. If you need to get to the center, you have to get off the rim. And if you have been not only adjusted to the rim, but addicted to the rim, it takes everything you can do and more to let go. and fall towards the center. That's the last thing that one would do. And it's the only thing that one can really do. So, one of the phrases in high mystical tradition, William Blake in his epic Jerusalem has over... Notice the machine not wanting to record it. Let me just patiently bring it back. On the front page of Blake's epic Jerusalem is the entrance to the netherworld, the underworld, and it reads over the portal, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Because the hope, which ostensibly is a great thing, is a necessary thing, is a sustaining thing in terms of the goddess, in terms of the Queen of Heaven, in terms of circular completeness, hope is always excellent. It's a part of faith, hope, and charity. But you cannot get to soul center with hope. It doesn't extend that far because it is a part of the rim. It is not a function of the center. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Now this "by" comes out later on. I see clearly there's nothing in the world with which we could buy so great a blessing. But if we did, what we could by not clinging to anything here and turned all our thoughts and conversations towards heaven, I certainly believe that this blessing would be given to us very quickly. Now this is her way of having the circle expand large enough to include, seemingly include, this possibility. A footnote on money. Teresa lived in the mid-1500s. In the mid-1500s, Spain became the richest country in the world, perhaps even richer than China, because it got all the gold from the New World. The whole Western Hemisphere's gold, except a little bit from Brazil that went to Portugal, all of it came to Spain. Now the gold was not made into coins, it was made into ingots. All the gold from the New World was made into ingots to get the symbolism. And on the ingots was stamped a big S for Spain and two lines that were the pillars of Hercules. And so the dollar sign is the Spanish Empire symbol of the New World gold. You cannot spell Savior with that S. We're going to come to Tacitus, but let's just review, because we've gotten very far along. We've pushed our sense of comprehension pretty far this morning. Here's what we've come up with. That on page 76 of St. Teresa, we have a chance to focus, one of the rare places on a single page in world literature that you can focus on just exactly why there is a built-in polarity, a structural duality in the outlook of a gender-biased civilization. The Egyptian civilization was always masculine. The Mesopotamian civilization was always feminine. Curiously enough, the oldest linking between the two was the origin of the Jews, and from Abrahamic Judaism lineage comes the problem in a nutshell, the polarity in a nutshell. The classic way in which Judaism handled the problem was that the people were the wife of God, that God was the husband of the people. It was not something that was come to consciously. It was not a political development. It was an non-stated, understated quality that rose finally And when a great jeopardy broke the Jewish people, the greatest prophetic voice of that time, Isaiah, said it was as if God had divorced his wife. This in the context of a time where the divorced wife was simply cast out into the world and had no place to be. In Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, in the Old Testament, Isaiah occurs about 700 BC. And with Isaiah, you find in here the quality of iniquity being characterized by the women of Jerusalem, the arrogant, proud women of Jerusalem. Here's how one translation of Isaiah puts it. And Yahweh said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with outstretched necks, and ogle with their eyes, mincing along as they go, tinkling with their feet, the Lord will bind up the crown of the daughters of Zion, and Yahweh will lay bare their forehead. On that day the Lord will take away the finery of the ankles, the headbands, the crescents, the pendants, the bracelets, the veils, the headdresses, the pacing chains, the sashes, the perfume, the amulets, the signet rings, the nose rings, the festal garments, the mantles, the cloaks, the handbags, the garments of gauze, the chemises, the turbans, the shawls, and instead of perfume, there shall be rottenness. Now this whole trousseau of accessories and appurtenances are all indications of worship of the Queen of Heaven, of Ishtar, of Ashtarte, of the ancient Queen of Heaven. And what was occasioned by this was the first time that the Neo-Babylonian Empire invaded Palestine and took the first wave of captives into exile. Isaiah then talks about a new Jerusalem that will come. This old Jerusalem, which was a wife of God, has whored herself so that God does not divorce his wife so much as he casts away a worthless woman who has prostituted herself to a different god. But there will be a new Jerusalem, and on that day, this is Isaiah, on that day, the day is called Yom Yahweh. On that day, notice the masculine tone here, day. Not that part of the cycle, but on a day which is at the very center of the whole pattern of a cycle. Isaiah already has an Egyptian masculine perfection tone to his prophetic assessment. This is why he is so polarized to the feminine qualities of the Great Mother. Her great motherness is great when you're a kid, but when you grow up and you see that she's a whore, especially a whore vis-a-vis God, her husband, this is the negative mother. This is the hag. The beautiful hag, Snow White's mother. On that day when Yahweh causes to shoot up, shall be beauty and glory and the fruit of the land, pride and adornment for the escaped Israel. And there will be a new Jerusalem. Now this particular quality, the fall because of worshiping the Queen of Heaven and making of the people then devotees of a matriarchal God, means then that the people of Israel themselves as a whole became like a great horror. There shall be a new Jerusalem, but it's only going to be from a remnant that endure by suffering a great woe. And Isaiah goes on and talks about the great woe. Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is no more room, and you settle alone in the land. Now this quality of Isaiah points to a historical development about 700 BC. Quite distinct from this is Jeremiah. Jeremiah is about 100 years later. Now, why are we talking about Isaiah and Jeremiah? Why are we talking about the prophets, Old Testament prophets? Because we're trying to understand why it is that the reoccurring problems of personality, exactly at the juncture where it should come together, does not work. Instead of coming together, an increased resistance, much more difficulty, comes into being. Why is this so? And we're talking about that, and we're trying to get down to the context which will allow a clearer vision of this. And it's an understanding of how history as a process is very real. History as a process is more real than ritual. It is more real than myth. And as long as we continue to have a taste for ritual and myth, we're not even doing anything effective in the processes of history. Nothing is getting done at all. You want to know why gangrene is setting in? Because nothing is being treated. It's like that. Jeremiah is completely different from Isaiah. He sees with these special eyes, but he talks about how there will be, in fact, a new covenant. His words, "Believe me, days are coming, Yahweh's word, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I had made with their fathers when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which covenant of mine they broke, though I was their Lord," Yahweh's word. "But this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel when that time comes. I will put my law within them and write it on their hearts and minds." The difference is Isaiah, though he has a poignant masculine criticism of relinquishing Yahweh for another God, the Queen of Heaven, the Great Mother, Isaiah is still within the circle of the Great Mother and issues a criticism from somewhere on that circle. Whereas Jeremiah's criticism, his prophecy, comes from exact center. He says it's not a question of a new wife. It's a question of a whole different structure. Instead of there being a continuance of the old covenant, renewing the old covenant, and allowing that circular cycle to continue, to reinstate itself, to have a new season, that there be a completely new structure, and instead of the covenant being a renewal on the rim of the cycle, it will be at the center of the cycle. It'll be written on the hearts within, be written on the mind within. The new covenant is an internal focus at the center and will not be a phenomenon of the circle at all. That cycle is finished. The Mosaic cycle is finished completely. It's gone. This produced a very curious response, because in later development there was no way that anyone noticed the difference between Isaiah and Jeremiah. And the reason for this is that the prophecies of Isaiah in 700 BC were extended by a different writer living 100 years later, contemporary of Jeremiah, who also wrote under the name Isaiah. In fact, it wasn't until very recently that there have even been critical studies on second Isaiah. Only about the last 100 years or so. This Oxford University Press study, Second Isaiah, published 1964. Introduction, historical background, first sentence. It is all but unanimously agreed that the historical background of Isaiah 40 to 55 is the closing years of the Babylonian exile. Now we know that the closing years of the Babylonian exile were in the reign of Cyrus the Great, who died about 529 BC, so that second Isaiah comes about 150 years later, about 50 years after Jeremiah. And it's in second Isaiah that you find a different kind of a quality, and the quality is summarized. There's another study from Oxford University Press, 1948, the suffering servant in Deutero-Isaiah. Deutero means second Isaiah. So that the prophecy of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, its first part was 700 BC, was all about the people being cast away, not divorced by God without good reason, because they had whored after the great mother, after the Queen of Heaven. And Jeremiah talks about the covenant being completely broken, never again to be reinstated, but a new covenant is possible, only this new one must be interior completely, at the soul's center only. Not on the ritual cycle at all, but at the soul's symbolic center. That the new covenant is only possible on symbolic level, on level of symbols, and that there will be no more ritual covenants at all, ever. So that second Isaiah, not knowing about Jeremiah, why? Because Jeremiah was taken prisoner by his own congregation when they fled to Egypt, to Tanis. And the exiles were taken to Babylon. And there was no contact between Tanis and Egypt and Babylon in the Neo-Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar. There was no contact. So when the Jews were let back into Palestine by Cyrus the Great, they had to, these were the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, they had a great difficulty in putting Judaism back together because it was completely fractured. Not only had people lost contact with how to do things and what the traditions were, But coming back, there were two completely different viewpoints. One was a viewpoint that was descended from Jeremiah, that there needs to be an interiorization of Yahweh to establish a new covenant within, and they were the Hasids. They were the forerunners of the Essenes. Whereas those trying to establish again the outer cycle, the outer circle, they were trying to reinstate in terms of first Isaiah. And the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah, and this is, you'll see how important this is for the Roman Empire in just a minute. Because the Roman Empire, greedy as it was, not only swallowed Greek culture whole and never digested it, but they swallowed Jewish theology whole and never digested it. And it comes through in St. Teresa and all the schools of the Roman Church, with all the flaws and all the pristine problems and dualities and polarities that were there so long ago that almost nobody remembers. And just a few doctors of civilization have their black bags stuffed with medicines because they were around then, treating it then. It's an old disease. You have to be a country doctor to recognize that infection because you hadn't seen it for a long time. What's important is that when Ezra and Nehemiah's reforms put together a way to hold a new shape of the cycle of the Torah, they divided the men from the women, and they said only men can hear the Torah. And that in order to keep the men occupied, we will portion out the reading of the Torah so that on each Sabbath only a certain portion will be read. In order to get the whole story, you will have to come to temple for a cycle of 3 years to get the entire Torah read. You will not know what the law of God is unless you come for a 3-year cycle. It's called the lectionary cycle in English. The shape of St. John's Gospel, the Gospel of St. John, is one last reading of the lectionary cycle. He's saying now that we have Jesus, we only have to learn it one last time because it will never change again forever. And so the Gospel of St. John is a reading of the Torah one last time to new ears. The men only will hear this, but the lineage of the Jewish tradition will pass only through women's blood. The women's blood will carry the efficacy of the line, but only the men will hear the Torah. So that the men and women will have to stay together in order to have it all. The men will hear the law, the women will carry the blood. The bloodline will be the way in which the jewels, the pearls, are put onto the necklace. It will be the string. And if they do not stay together, there will be no necklace. If the bloodline is separated from the law, Judaism will fall apart. It will not happen. So that the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah made this kind of shape, this kind of form. Now what's peculiar in here, what's very peculiar in here, is that the new covenant of the Jeremiah tradition has nothing to do with blood. It has to do with spirit. It has to do with distilling the blood into spirit. That the blood undistilled doesn't have any carrying efficacy at all. It's only blood distilled into spirit that has the efficacy. And because the blood has to be distilled and transformed into spirit, the law has to be transformed and distilled into interior structure. That an exterior law has nothing to do with an interior spirit. Now, none of this was understood. None of this became crunchable until the early 2nd century BC. And the first visionary, he wasn't in the historical process because he didn't understand history, but he was a visionary, and his name was Enoch. And the book of Enoch is a visionary seeing of this complete confabulation that Judaism had reached by about 190, 195 BC. That it was in a complete polarized bind. And this transcendental vision of Enoch was that there needs to be some kind of extension of man's comprehension beyond the earth. He has to go as high as heaven, and he has to go as low as hell. He has to be able to see the netherworld underneath, and he has to see the overworld above. And so the vision of Enoch enlarges the context and calls out for a new cycle of the Great Mother. She's now going to have to be really cosmic. She's going to have to include in her cycle not only the earth, but what's underneath it and what's above it. But it also calls forth, on the other polarity, for an increased perfection of the interiorization of men. So on the one hand, you have Hellenistic Judaism that develops into synchronistic levels that were unheard of in previous Judaism. Hellenistic Judaism becomes the widest spectrum of religious experience in the world. By 100 BC, Hellenistic Judaism became almost like an interplanetary religion. It had elements from everywhere, but all of it was distillable in terms of an interior presence. But at the very same time, you had an increasing masculine perfection taste for towing the line of increasingly refined laws. Those were the Essenes. At the same time as Hellenistic Judaism becoming a planetary religious amalgam, you have the increasingly strict perfection of the true Essenes. So you have strict perfection at the same time as international Hellenism. Both at the very same time. Unresolvable seemingly. The one making the center an ever more precise point within a point within a point. The other making Hellenistic Judaism larger and more tied into other things, all at the same time. The resolution of this comes about 10 years before Jesus is born. It comes about 20 BC. And the document that it comes in is called the Book of Wisdom, or sometimes it's called the Wisdom of Solomon. And in the Wisdom of Solomon, written in Alexandria, the Alexandrian Jewish community, very, very large. Philo estimated at about 1 million people, which made it larger than the population of all of Palestine. There were more Jews in Alexandria than there were in Palestine. But there was no temple in Alexandria. And the reason they didn't need a temple is that they had the Jeremiah tradition of inner temple. And as long as they took themselves to a collected place for the community, the synagogue, their interior temple was intact and they could share their interior temples together in the synagogue. That's the Jeremiah tradition in Judaism. Very rarefied, actually. It becomes the focus of what became monastic Christianity. Jeremiah Alexandrian Judaism becomes Christian monasticism. Whereas the Isaiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, toe-the-line law, Essene Judaism becomes Roman Catholic priesthood. And the priests and the monks, though they're in the same religion per se, are polarized exactly, diametrically, on issue of where reality is. Because if it's in you, it ain't in the cathedral. It ain't in the Pope, who's the king of the hierarchy of that cycle. And the monastic criticism is always that hidden underneath those kinds of empire building, temple building, king-pope hierarchies is a hidden secret predilection for the Queen of Heaven. And that eventually, just like cream rising to the surface, even though it may take a long time, eventually they will deify the Queen of Heaven again. And it took the Roman Church 1950 years to do it. They did it. In 1950, the assumption of the Virgin Mary as the Queen of Heaven was official church dogma. At the time, one of the most poignant minds alive on the planet, Carl Jung, wrote this in a monograph on psychological aspects of the mother archetype. When in 1938 I originally wrote this paper, I naturally did not know that 12 years later the Christian version of the mother archetype would be elevated to the rank of a dogmatic truth. The Christian Queen of Heaven has obviously shed all her Olympian qualities except for her brightness, goodness, and eternality, and even her human body, the thing most prone to gross material corruption, has been put on an ethereal incorruptibility. The richly varied allegories of the Mother of God have nevertheless retained some connection with her pagan prefigurations in Isis and others. The assumption of the Blessed Virgin as now the Queen of Heaven makes her dying son a resurgent God. The Queen of Heaven is master of tomb and womb. She is master of death in the tomb and of making the tomb into a womb so that there is rebirth. That's the key to her cycle. That's what makes that cycle go. She is master of tomb and womb. Her son can live again, but has to be reborn again each year. I don't know if the vampire mythos comes out of this, that you have to have a new fix of blood in order to keep living forever. As Jung points out, at the time, he was absolutely psychologically stunned because he saw it as a psychotic development. It's not a neurotic syndrome. It is a psychotic development on archetypal level. It means that the psychic wholeness has cracked and will never be put back together again. There's no glue for that kind of crack. It's like a bell that is cracked in that way will never ring again. You have to melt it all down and cast a new bell. What's peculiar about this is exactly this kind of condition is there at the founding of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. And the Roman Empire, this is where we come to Tacitus, and I guess we'll have to come next week. It's like a cereal, right? Cliffhanger. If you want to get a head start on it, you can always buy your own copy of Tacitus and read your own stuff. Read the section on signs and wonders, page 263. Vespasian in Alexandria, and all of the miracles that prove that he was the Messiah of the New Age. He was the son that was going to restart the whole cycle. So that the Roman Empire predilection was for the Mesopotamian Queen of Heaven mother archetype. Why were they such suckers for that? And this is not to denigrate the feminine at all, not to denigrate the Great Mother. Great respect for Anahita. I'm going to do a book on Anahita. But as Jung points out, there's a peculiarity for the young masculine vis-a-vis the Great Mother that, if not dealt with consciously, smears all of the defining structural qualities of the male psyche. He has it here. It's in Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, Volume 9, Part 1 of the Collected Works, page 94. The overdeveloped eros. The overdeveloped eros. The body has a satiation. But when the ego takes over the body, the ego has no satiation. It will push you beyond exhaustion. You're never satisfied. Because to the ego, the sign of progress is more. Do you remember in Key Largo where Humphrey Bogart says to Edward G. Robinson, Johnny Rocco, he says, I know what you want. You want more. He says, yeah. Yeah, that's what I want. I want more. Jung writes, I draw a very unfavorable picture of this type as we encounter it in the field of psychopathology. But this type, uninviting as it appears, also has positive aspects which society could ill afford to do without. Indeed, behind what is possibly the worst effect of this attitude, the unscrupulous wrecking of marriages. Why is it this? Why is the psychopathology always this? Because this is always the flaw line. Remember the marriage between God and his people? Wrecked. It's the way the flaw line works. It's that marriage does not work once this flaw is there. And one of the symptoms is that marriage is not workable. The unscrupulous wrecking of marriages. Jung writes, we can see an extremely significant and purposeful arrangement of nature. In other words, there's a wonderful arrangement vis-a-vis nature, but marriage has a quality which is transcendent to nature. We're not talking about just family, mother, father of children. The tribe always works children in. There are no orphans in a tribe. We're talking about marriage as a conscious differentiation of two individuals who then come together on individual meeting individual basis, that doesn't work. Unless there is some transnatural, out of the cycle, off the circle, centering, which both are capable of reaching together. That doesn't work. Not only do two individuals find it impossible to meet together in the center, either one or anyone finds it impossible to be at the center. The same flaw that forbids marriage to work forbids a person to be transcendently whole and perfect. Very same thing. Same illness. Jung writes, this type often develops in reaction to a mother who is wholly a thrall of nature, purely instinctive and therefore all-devouring. The unscrupulously natural mother, all-inclusive mother, is also all-devouring at the same time. Such a mother, writes Jung, and he means psychologically, after consciousness develops psychologically then, it is an anachronism. It's a throwback. It's a regression. Such a mother is an anachronism, a throwback to a primitive state of matriarchy, where the man leads an insipid existence as a mere procreator and serf of the soil. In fact, it comes from the agrarian, agricultural, repeating annual cycle forever quality of mythology and ritual. It doesn't occur in hunter societies. It occurs in agrarian societies. In Fraser's The Golden Bough, 100 years ago, he called it the corn mother. Because that, in a nutshell, tells it, positions it. The reactive intensification of the daughter's eros is aimed at some man who ought to be rescued from the preponderance of the female maternal element in his life. Going to take him away from his mother. Mature him. For me. A woman of this type instinctively intervenes when provoked by the unconsciousness of the marriage partner. She will disturb that comfortable ease so dangerous to the personality of a man, but frequently regarded by him as marital faithfulness. This complacency leads to blank unconsciousness of his own personality, and to those supposedly ideal marriages where he is nothing but dad, and she is nothing but mom, and they even call each other that. This is a slippery path that can easily degrade marriage to the level of mere breeding pen. A woman of this type directs the burning ray of her eros upon a man whose life is stifled by maternal solicitude, and by doing so she arouses a moral conflict. Yet without this there can be no consciousness of personality. And then he writes very poignantly, he says, people will ask, but why on earth, you may ask, should it be necessary for man to achieve, by hook or crook, a higher level of consciousness? What is all this about? This is truly, writes Jung, the crucial question. And I do not find the answer easy. Instead of a real answer, I can only make a confession of faith. And here he recounts something poignant from his own life. He recounts it more deeply in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections on page 286. But here's what he says in Psychological Aspects of the Mother Archetype. This is his confession of faith. Why do we need to have higher consciousness? Here it is. I believe that after thousands and millions of years, someone had to realize that this wonderful world of mountains and oceans, suns and moons, galaxy and nebula, plants and animals, exists. From a low hill in the Athi plains of East Africa, I once watched the vast herds of wild animals grazing in soundless stillness, as they had done from time immemorial, touched only by the breath of a primeval world. I felt then as if I were the first man, the first creature, to know that all this is. The entire world round me was still in the primeval state. It did not know that it was. And then, in that one moment in which I came to know, the world sprang into being. Without that moment, it would never have been. All nature seeks this goal and finds it fulfilled in man, and only in the most highly developed and most fully conscious man. Each advance, every advance, even the smallest along this path of conscious realization, adds that much to the world. Now, what's peculiar in this, when you read about signs and wonders, the sign, the wonder that cued Vespasian into believing that he should make a play to become the Roman emperor, and indeed replace the whole Caesar line for the first time in Roman history with the Flavians, which set the tone for there being all kinds of extensions of the Roman Empire, and likewise all kinds of new popes, even though they're not related to each other in any family way. The transmission outside of a family line of the power of the hierarchical king of the world comes because Vespasian in Alexandria had a vision of a man named Basilides greeting him in the temple of Serapis, and it was later discovered that this Basilides of Alexandria was some 80 miles away when it happened, and Vespasian was convinced by that the god had come to him in the form of Basilides. Now, when Jung was having his psychological breakdown, his psychotic little bout, that is illustrated in word and image, he has his teacher, his spirit teacher, Philemon, from Alexandria, and he dictates to Jung the 7 sermons of the dead, and when it begins, the 7 sermons of the dead, this is my friend Dr. Heller's translation of it, 7 exhortations to the dead written by Basilides in Alexandria, the city where East and West meet. It's this Basilides that Vespasian saw, that Jung saw, who is the archetype of the renewal of a cycle on the circle. Without making too much out of it, in a very odd way, Jung was another member of the Ezra Nehemiah reconstruction team. And amazingly, though he thought himself at the center, was not. He was on the rim also. The Seigneur is very poignant. And as the old chivalric tarot card Anahita ritual has it, you only get there by being able to cross the sword bridge. And you can only do that with a guide. Zarathustra, 4,400 years ago, called her Diana. The guide is really Anahita herself. Because the only way off the rim of the circle is to leave the entire circle at once. And that is only done by permission of the great goddess to go, to leave. And that is the essence of the hero's task. to let go of the entire circle at once. You cannot let go of any one point on it, because the sheer gravity of the circle brings you back again and again. It's only by imploding completely from the rim all at once that one is able to get to the center. Oddly enough, and I'm glad this is not on the tape, this is the principle of making an atomic bomb. The problem that our friends in Los Alamos faced was that they could not get an implosion strong enough to ignite the refined uranium to make a fission reaction. And Oppenheimer entrusted the problem to a number of geniuses, and the geniuses found some British explosive experts who developed a sphere that had wedge-shaped charges, and that all of the charges would ignite at the very same instant, and all of their explosive power would go to the same point at the center. That's why atom bombs are like spheres, the original ones. And it's only by implosion from completeness that one can reach the soul center. This is why consciousness on this scale is radical. There's no nice way to get there. There's no pleasant, easy, socially lovable way to get there. It's the goddamnedest thing you can imagine. Let's leave it there.